Mississippi, 1923, a land where the night held its breath and the soil remembered every scream it swallowed. In the small town of Coldwater, a woman walked with her eyes lowered, her voice soft, and her spirit wrapped in mourning. Her name was Evelyn Cross, a seamstress, a widow, and a ghost in a place that pretended not to see her. But beneath her quiet steps lived a storm forged from loss. The Klan had taken her brother, Isaiah, not with bullets, but with a rope swaying beneath an oak older than the town itself. The sheriff called it justice. The men in robes called it order, but Evelyn called it an awakening. She was not a fighter by nature, nor a speaker by calling. Her strength lived in the shadows, in watching what others ignored, in hearing what others dismissed. What she lacked in force, she carried in silence, and in that silence she discovered something rare. She could move among them unseen. Her skin was light enough to pass in a crowd, her manner meek, enough to attract no suspicion, and her grief deep enough to teach patience. She did not raise a weapon. She did not shout in rage. What she sought was truth, names, roots, secrets. And truth, she learned, was an empire that collapsed from within. And so began the quiet war of Evelyn Cross, a war waged not with fire or blood, but with knowledge gathered in locked rooms and whispered meetings. She would step into the lion's den, wearing the quiet armor of obedience, only to slip away, with the pieces needed to bring their kingdom down. 11 commanders ruled the Klan's operations across Tate County. 11 men strutted through the night, as if darkness belonged to them. But long before they sensed the shift in the wind, their downfall had already begun, carried in the careful hands of a woman they never bothered to fear. The wind moved strangely through Coldwater that evening, carrying with it a quiet tension Evelyn had learned to recognize, the kind that settled over the delta before something shifted in the dark. She walked home from the dress shop with her shawl pulled tight, passing storefronts where white men laughed too loudly and spoke too freely, believing nobody listened. But Evelyn always listened. She collected their careless words like seeds, storing each one in the hidden corners of her mind. The memory of Isaiah's last day played in the back of her thoughts, guiding her steps with a heaviness she could not escape. Every creak of a porchboard, every murmured threat drifting from a barroom doorway reminded her why she stayed silent. Silence was her weapon now, sharp, deliberate, and far more dangerous than any knife. That night, as Evelyn lit the lamp in her small kitchen, the flame danced uneasily, flickering in a way that made her pause. She removed her coat, smoothed the wrinkles from her dress, and opened the floorboard beneath the table. Inside were the notebooks she'd filled over months, dates of meetings, names whispered by careless men, routes used by hooded riders who believed themselves untouchable. She traced one name with her finger, Caleb Harding, a lieutenant whose arrogance preceded him like a shadow. She had watched him for weeks, studying his patterns, his habits, the way he loosened his tongue after whiskey, and the way he strutted through the marketplace as if the streets bowed to him. Tomorrow, she told herself, would be her first step toward the heart of the organization that had stolen her brother. When the moon rose high above the slow-moving river, Evelyn wrapped her hair in a simple scarf and stepped into the night. Her footsteps were steady, unhurried, blending with the hum of insects and the far-off cry of a train. She made her way toward the old lodge at the edge of town, where Harding and his men gathered under the guise of civic duty. It was a place built from rotted timber and rotted beliefs, its windows shuttered, its doors locked, but its secrets poorly guarded. Evelyn stood in the shadows across the road, heart pounding with a rhythm Isaiah once called courage. She watched the men enter the lodge one by one, carrying their robes under their arms like trophies. She breathed deeply, committing their faces to memory. 11 leaders, 11 pillars of cruelty. She whispered into the wind, one at a time. Evelyn's chance came sooner than she expected. The following afternoon she walked into Harding's general store, a place she rarely visited but one she had studied from afar. The bell above the door jingled, and Harding looked up from behind the counter with the smug confidence of a man convinced the world existed for his convenience. Evelyn lowered her gaze, offering the quiet smile of a woman accustomed to being overlooked. "Need work done?" she asked softly, holding up a basket of mending she had finished for a neighbor. Harding's eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Assessing her usefulness the way a farmer might evaluate a mule, she felt the familiar chill of being appraised, but she also felt power in her invisibility. After a moment he nodded, grunting, "Got some things need stitching. Come by the lodge tonight." His words were careless, his trust a crack in the armor she intended to break wide open. That evening, the sun dipped behind the pines, turning the sky the color of fading embers. Evelyn approached the lodge with measured steps, her heart thrumming steady but strong. The building stood silent, its windows dark, but she could hear murmurs behind the walls, voices discussing routes, targets, and punishments. She knocked once. Harding opened the door with the look of a man who believed he held complete dominion over the world inside. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. Evelyn kept her expression humble, her posture small. "You asked," she replied simply. He led her into a cramped room where uniforms lay scattered. Across a table, white fabric stained with dirt and sweat. "Fix these," he said. As he turned to leave, he didn't notice the quick sweep of her eyes, the way she silently catalogued every detail, the map on the wall, the list of names pinned beside it, the ledger partially hidden under a stack of robes. Alone in the room, Evelyn moved with precision. She stitched quietly, her needle sliding through cloth as if through time itself. Her hands worked, but her mind wandered across the map. She had memorized in seconds, meeting sites marked with crude symbols, initials of men she recognized from whispered rumors. She absorbed every thread of information, weaving it into her purpose. When the voices in the next room grew louder, she leaned forward, ears sharp, catching fragments of a plan for a midnight raid 2 towns over. Her breath tightened, but she kept sewing, her face blank, her hands steady. When Harding returned, he found her just as he left her, silent. Obedient, unthreatening. He never noticed the glint in her eyes, the spark of knowledge quietly taking root. As she stepped back into the night, the cool air welcomed her like an ally. She had entered their world unnoticed. She had left, carrying their downfall in her hands. The night of the planned raid arrived with a sky heavy and swollen, clouds drifting low as if listening. Evelyn sat by her small window, hands folded in her lap. The map from the lodge burned into her memory. She had written nothing down. Paper could betray her, but her mind never would. When the church bell tolled 9 times, she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped outside. The streets of Coldwater were quiet, lanterns dim, dogs curled on porches. Yet beneath the stillness ran an undercurrent of danger, the kind Evelyn had learned to feel in her bones. She walked quickly toward the river path, where shadows gathered like witnesses. There, hidden by reeds taller than her shoulders, she waited for the riders to move. She didn't need to see their faces. She already knew their names, their patterns, their sins. As the first hoofbeats echoed through the trees, Evelyn crouched low, her breath shallow but controlled. The riders emerged in a staggered line, 11 men clothed not yet in robes, but in the arrogance of men who believed darkness made them omnipotent. They spoke in short, clipped orders, unaware that every word carried straight into Evelyn's ears. She watched them cross the wooden bridge toward the next town, the place marked with a triangle on Harding's map, the place where a family was rumored to be taught a lesson. Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest, a slow burning anger that pulsed like a heartbeat. She waited until the riders had disappeared into the blackness before she began to move. Her steps were swift now, purposeful, carrying her toward the sheriff's outpost. She knew the sheriff's loyalties, knew that he answered to the same men who met in the lodge. But tonight, she needed a different ally. Beside the outpost stood an old telegraph office, manned by a wiry operator named Thomas Burke, a man despised by the Klan for refusing to join their ranks. Evelyn slipped into the office's back door, startling Burke, who nearly dropped his cup of coffee. "Mrs. Cross," he whispered, eyes wide. She leaned close, voice low but urgent. "They're riding to Elm Creek tonight. 11 men. You need to warn Pastor Hemphill. He's got 6 families in that church." Burke hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes, but Evelyn held his gaze until he understood. Silence, was no longer an option. Within seconds, he tapped out the message with trembling fingers. Evelyn stood in the shadows, listening to the metal keys click like tiny gunshots, each one sending a ripple across the county. When the message was done, Burke looked at her with awe and confusion. "How'd you know?" he asked. Evelyn pulled her shawl tight and stepped back into the night. "Because they think no one's watching," she said softly. "But I am. Word travels differently in the Delta, sometimes slow as molasses, sometimes swift as a brush fire. That night, it moved like lightning. By the time the riders reached the outskirts of Elm Creek, the churchyard was no longer silent. Lanterns glowed behind shuttered windows, men gathered at the doors with hunting rifles, and inside, families huddled close in pews worn smooth by generations of whispered prayers. Evelyn had never stepped foot in that church, yet her presence filled its walls like a quiet guardian. The riders approached expecting docile fear, but instead found a community braced, waiting. From her place hidden along the ridge, Evelyn watched the silhouettes of the armed townsmen stand tall against the approaching hooves. The riders slowed, uncertain, glancing at each other as the realization dawned. Someone had warned them. Caleb Harding was the first to curse under his breath, his confidence cracking like thin ice. He raised his arm to signal a retreat, furious and humiliated. The others followed, muttering, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting a pursuer. They didn't know Evelyn watched from the dark, her face calm, her breath steady. She felt no triumph, only the steady burn of purpose guiding her step by step. When the riders disappeared back into the trees, she turned toward the road home, her boots sinking into the soft earth. She had spared innocent lives tonight, but she knew their reprisal would be swift. The Klan did not tolerate embarrassment. They would search for the leak, hunt for the weakness, and she would be ready when they did. The next morning, Coldwater buzzed with rumors. The lodge door slammed open and shut all day as Harding and his men demanded answers no one had. Evelyn moved through town as she always did, modest, quiet, nearly invisible, while the air around her thickened with suspicion. She stopped at the marketplace for flour, listened at the well as women whispered prayers, and watched Harding pace outside his store, red-faced and trembling. That afternoon, as she walked past the telegraph office, Thomas Burke stepped outside, his expression tight. "They're asking questions," he murmured. Evelyn didn't break her stride. "Then give them no answers." She continued down the road, her eyes on the horizon, knowing the first crack in their foundation had begun. She had not struck with violence, she had struck with truth, and truth, once freed, had a way of unraveling even the strongest chains. The lodge grew quieter in the days that followed, its walls once filled with boastful laughter, now echoing with suspicion. Evelyn saw the change before anyone spoke it aloud, the way Harding's eyes darted from face to face, the way men lowered their voices even when the street was empty. Something fragile had cracked inside their ranks, and she could feel the tremor each time she walked past their gathering places. She moved through town like a soft wind, touching nothing yet sensing everything. One afternoon, while fitting Mrs. Collier's dress in the back of the shop, Evelyn caught a snippet of conversation, drifting from the front room. Harding was convinced a traitor lived among them. "Someone's leak in," he said, voice rough with embarrassment. "And I'll find who." Evelyn's hands paused mid-stitch, then continued as though nothing had changed. But something had. The hunters had become the hunted, and they didn't even know who stalked their steps. That evening, Evelyn returned to the lodge under the guise of picking up more sewing work. The air inside thickened with tension, sweat, and suspicion. Harding handed her a bundle of robes, but this time his eyes lingered, searching her face for secrets she hid beneath years of practiced stillness. She lowered her gaze, allowing her breath to slow, her hands to tremble slightly. The portrait of a meek woman intimidated by men's anger. He grunted and waved her away, convinced she posed no threat. As she walked toward the back room, she noted the subtle shift in the lodge's interior. The map she once memorized was gone, replaced by a locked drawer. Ledger books had been moved. The men had grown cautious, yet their fear made them sloppy. A set of keys left on a chair, a half-burned list crumpled near the stove, ashes still, warm. Evelyn bent to retrieve a fallen handkerchief and in a glance read the edge of a name on the discarded paper, the initials of a commander who oversaw 3 counties. Later, when she left the lodge with the bundle of robes pressed against her chest, the night felt unusually still. The moon hovered low, its pale glow spilling across the empty road like spilled milk. She walked quickly, the crumpled corner of the burned paper hidden in her sleeve. At home, she laid it on the table, smoothing the ash-blackened fragment with gentle fingers. The name was incomplete but unmistakable. J.R. Harlow, one of the highest-ranking men in the region. She breathed slowly, feeling the weight of this revelation settle into her bones. Harlow's presence explained the secrecy, the panic, the fear trembling beneath Harding's anger. This wasn't about a simple raid gone wrong. It was about maintaining power, reputation, terror. Evelyn looked toward the window, listening to the quiet hum of crickets beyond the glass. 11 men, she whispered, and one has stepped into the open. Tomorrow, she knew, would demand more from her than silence alone. Morning came with a thin veil of fog that clung to the town like a warning. Evelyn stepped onto her porch, listening to the muted sounds of cold water. A wagon wheel creaking, a rooster calling, a child coughing somewhere beyond the sycamore trees. On the surface, everything appeared unchanged, but beneath it lay an unspoken dread. People felt the tension even if they didn't know its source. As she passed the general store, she caught sight of Harding speaking with 2 strangers, men whose posture carried authority, whose polished boots and stiff collars marked them as outsiders. Evelyn slowed her steps, her eyes tracing their faces with discreet care. She felt the familiar prickling at the base of her neck. Danger had multiplied. These were not common members. They were enforcers, the kind the Klan summoned when discipline faltered, and they had arrived because of her. She entered the store quietly, pretending to browse the bolts of fabric stacked near the counter. The strangers spoke in hushed tones, but hushed meant nothing to Evelyn. She could hear meaning in the spaces between words. "Harlow wants answers," one man muttered. "This embarrassment can't happen again." Harding nodded stiffly, his fear now palpable. "We'll find the leak," he insisted. "Whoever's talking, we'll root 'em out." Evelyn's fingertips grazed a spool of thread as she listened, her expression calm, but her mind racing through possibilities. If Harlow had taken personal interest, the stakes had risen beyond cold water. She needed to move faster, dig deeper, and strike with even greater care. When Harding finally noticed her, he softened his expression into something resembling friendliness. Unaware, she had overheard every word. "Miss Cross," he said, "your work's needed." "At the lodge again tonight?" Evelyn forced a small nod, heart steady, voice quiet. Of course. As she walked home through the narrow dirt road, Evelyn reviewed every detail she had gathered. The burned paper, the arrival of outside command, the tightening grip of fear within their ranks. She understood that she now stood on a thin line between discovery and triumph. The next steps would require not just silence, but precision. At her kitchen table, she spread out the robes she had taken for mending, fingers tracing the stitching, while her mind traced the patterns of men in power. Harlow, Harding, the enforcers. She whispered their names like a litany, committing them to memory. Then she did something she hadn't done since Isaiah's death. She lit a candle, opened his worn Bible, and rested her hand on the page. "Guide my steps," she murmured, "and let my silence speak louder than their terror." Outside, the fog began to lift, but the path ahead remained, shadowed. It was in those shadows that Evelyn intended to walk, unseen, unwavering, unstoppable. Night fell with a heaviness that seemed to press against the earth itself, as if the delta understood the danger gathering in its folds. Evelyn approached the lodge with a basket of mending tucked beneath her arm, her footsteps light, her breath measured. She could feel the shift in the air before she even reached the door. voices sharper, boots pacing, suspicion coiled tight like a drawn bow. Inside, the room buzzed with an agitation she had not yet seen among them. Harding barked orders with false authority, while the two enforcers stood silent, their cold eyes sweeping the room with calculated intent. When Evelyn entered, a hush cut through the noise. She lowered her head, stepping lightly toward the table of robes, as though she were nothing more than a servant completing a simple task. But her mind scanned every corner, every tense gesture, every whisper sharpening the edge of the night. As she stitched, Harding began questioning the men in the room, one by one, demanding alibis, pressing for confessions. The enforcers watched without blinking, their presence a blade held against everyone's throat. Evelyn listened while her needle moved, quiet as a heartbeat. She heard fear in their responses, stammered explanations, trembling voices, yet something else began to surface. Doubt. Doubt in leadership, doubt in loyalty, doubt in the system they relied on to intimidate others. Harding, caught between humiliation and desperation, pushed harder, pacing so close to Evelyn that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Someone here's undermining us," he growled, "and Harlow won't have it." His anger radiated through the room, but beneath it she sensed his terror. He feared Harlow more than he feared any outsider, and that fear was a crack Evelyn intended to widen. Near the end of the night, Harding dismissed the others, but asked Evelyn to stay. Her pulse quickened, but she maintained her stillness. He leaned closer than propriety ever allowed, his suspicion simmering beneath a thin veneer of courtesy. "You hear things, don't you?" he asked. "People talk around you 'cause you're quiet." Her smile was faint, almost shy. "I listen only to what concerns my work." Harding studied her carefully, searching for guilt in her calm eyes. She let the silence stretch, the weight of her humility becoming its own shield. Finally, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. "If you hear something strange," he said, "you come straight to me." Evelyn nodded, folding the finished robe. As she stepped outside, the air hit her like a baptism, cool, sharp, awakening. Her heart steadied as she walked into the darkness. They suspected everyone except her, and in that blind spot she moved like a shadow, preparing to swallow the men who believed fear belonged only to them. Dawn crept in with a brittle cold, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. Evelyn had slept little, her mind replaying every gesture, every tremor, every accusation inside the lodge. She knew the enforcers would not remain idle. Their arrival meant the Klan's hierarchy felt threatened enough to tighten its grip, but danger for them meant opportunity for her. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the morning light, watching the first wagons roll past on the road. The town seemed unchanged. Children carrying water buckets, men on their way to the mill, yet beneath the familiar rhythm, she sensed unease. Harding and the enforcers had visited several homes during the night, demanding information, stirring fear. She saw the way neighbors avoided eye contact, how the air carried a muted tension. Silence, once her ally, was now a blanket suffocating cold water. By midday, she made her way to the telegraph office. Burke stood at the counter, his hands trembling as he sorted through a stack of receipts. When he saw her, he glanced toward the street before speaking. "They came here too," he whispered. "Asked about messages. Asked if I'd heard anything unusual." Evelyn stepped closer, her voice steady. "What did you tell them?" Burke swallowed hard. "That I mind my own business." She nodded. "Good. Keep doing that." She reached into her sleeve and slid him a folded scrap of cloth, a code she'd created, stitched with subtle patterns, only the two of them. "Understood. If you see these symbols again, it means dangers coming from outside the county. Send word to Pastor Hemphill." Burke's gaze softened with gratitude and fear. Evelyn stepped back, dissolving into the afternoon bustle like a whisper swallowed by the wind. She was preparing not just herself now, but the entire chain of quiet resistance she had begun to build. When the sun dipped low, she walked the dirt path toward the abandoned sawmill on the edge of the pines, a place used by the Klan for storage and strategizing. She had observed the comings and goings for weeks, and tonight the enforcers' horses were tied outside, their tacks still dusted with the travel of distant roads. Evelyn circled the building, slipping through a narrow gap in the boards. Inside, the room smelled of pine shavings, oil, and damp earth. Papers littered a table, schedules, names, and, most importantly, a sealed letter bearing Harlow's crest. Her breath caught, but her hands remained steady as she opened it. The contents confirmed her suspicion. Harlow planned a purge, starting with men he believed disloyal. The lodge was fracturing, and he intended to rebuild it with fear sharper than any blade. Evelyn folded the letter and tucked it beneath her shawl. As she slipped back into the night, she whispered a single promise into the cold air. "Your day is coming, Harlow, and it will arrive as quietly as mine." Night had fully claimed the Delta when Evelyn returned home, the folded letter tucked safely beneath the worn floorboard where she kept her most dangerous truths. She sat for a long moment in silence, the flicker of the kerosene lamp casting soft shadows across her modest kitchen. Her hands lay still in her lap, but her mind raced ahead, mapping every consequence of Harlow's looming purge. 11 commanders ruled the surrounding counties, each convinced of his own untouchable authority, but fear had begun to corrode their certainty, loosening ties that once bound them tightly together. Evelyn understood something they did not. Power that rests on fear collapses under suspicion. Tonight, she would strike the first quiet blow against the man at the center of their hierarchy, not with a weapon, but with truth placed in the right place at the right time. Before dawn, she walked along the riverbank toward a small cabin hidden beneath drooping oaks, a safe place known only to a few families who resisted silently. Inside, Pastor Hemphill and 2 deacons waited, their eyes heavy with worry. She laid Harlow's letter on the table. Hemphill read it slowly, his expression tightening with each line. "If this is true," he murmured, "they'll turn on their own soon enough." Evelyn nodded. "That's the plan, but they need a push." The pastor looked up, searching her face. "What kind of push?" She spoke calmly, knowing the weight her words carried. "Let the lower ranks believe some commanders are planning betrayals. Let the commanders believe their men are talking. They'll choke themselves trying to root out threats that aren't there." The men exchanged glances. Hemphill set the letter down gently. "You're walking a razor's edge, child." Evelyn's eyes held steady. "I've been walking it since they took Isaiah." By mid-morning, the seeds she planted began to take root. Whispered rumors drifted through back alleys and over store counters, rumors crafted with precision, always. Vague enough to evade suspicion, yet sharp enough to strike doubt into hardened hearts. Harding's men watched each other with narrowed eyes, their camaraderie dissolving into distrust. The enforcers questioned every movement, every hesitation, hunting for a traitor that did not exist. Evelyn observed from a distance, never lingering long enough to be noticed. She saw the way Harding snapped at a fellow officer in the street, accusing him of withholding information. She noticed how one of the enforcers confronted a lieutenant behind the post office, voices raised, tempers near breaking. And through it all, Evelyn remained a quiet thread, weaving deeper into the unraveling cloth of their unity. As she walked home, the afternoon sun cast her shadow long across the dirt road. She paused, letting the warm light settle over her like a blessing. 11 men stood tall in their pride, unaware that the silence they dismissed had already begun to dismantle them from within. The tension in cold water grew thick enough to taste. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of suspicion from one porch to the next. Evelyn moved through town with steady steps, keeping her expression soft and unreadable, while the storm she had stirred churned around her. Harding barked orders in the street with the desperation of a man losing control of his own shadow. The enforcers spread out across the county, interrogating their own men, dragging officers into back rooms for questioning. Evelyn watched from behind lowered lashes, noting each outburst, each fracture, each moment when loyalty cracked beneath the weight of fear. The 11 commanders who once walked like pillars of authority now paced like trapped beasts. Their disarray was the first true sign that Harlow's empire was beginning to crumble. That evening, Evelyn returned to the lodge with a fresh bundle of robes, her demeanor quiet and dutiful. Inside, the air shimmered with anger barely. Contained, a lieutenant named Morrow stood red-faced, shouting that someone had planted false accusations against him. Harding yelled back, hurling blame with reckless abandon. The enforcers watched both men with hard, assessing eyes, searching for guilt in every tremor. Evelyn slipped into the back room, but their voices followed her through the walls, rising and falling like waves crashing against a failing shore. She set the robes on the table, her fingers brushing the familiar worn wood, and let the chaos wash over her. Each accusation, each insult, each moment of distrust served her purpose. She studied the lodge's interior, now cluttered with discarded papers and overturned chairs, a physical reflection of the unraveling within their ranks. When she stepped outside later, the world was drenched in darkness, broken only by the thin moon pulling pale light across the road. She paused beneath the shadow of a sycamore tree, listening as the lodge door slammed. Behind her, the sound echoed like a verdict. Ahead, the dirt path stretched quiet and empty, but Evelyn knew eyes hid in that darkness. The Klan's fractured leaders had begun watching the town more closely, desperate to root out the unseen force eroding them from within. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath steady, her heartbeat calm. Fear did not guide her now. Purpose did, sharpened by Isaiah's memory and the countless lives threatened by the 11 men who believed themselves untouchable. She walked into the night with a growing certainty. The fall of their empire would not come through confrontation, but through the quiet collapse of trust. And tomorrow she would strike at that trust once more. By sunrise, the fractures Evelyn had sown were no longer whispers. They were open wounds. The 11 commanders who once ruled the region with synchronized cruelty now moved like strangers, circling one another with suspicion sharpened to a blade. Evelyn watched the shift unfold as she carried a basket of laundry past the courthouse. 2 commanders argued near the steps, their voices tight and heated, gestures stiff with accusation. A third stood apart, arms crossed, eyes darting toward the alley as though betrayal might leap from the shadows at any moment. The enforcers, sent by Harlow himself, spent the morning dragging 3 officers from their homes, demanding confessions that did not exist. Fear had hollowed out their unity, and into that hollow space Evelyn poured silence, a silence that widened cracks, loosened bonds, and turned arrogance into paranoia. Every step she took through town felt like turning a screw deeper into the machinery of their unraveling. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the sawmill once more. She approached with the same caution as before, slipping along the side wall and pressing her ear against the weathered boards. Inside, voices hissed with fury. One enforcer accused Harding of withholding information. Another claimed the Lieutenant Morrow was secretly reporting to Harlow behind their backs. Harding's voice cracked under the weight of panic. "I don't know who's talking," he shouted, "but someone in this county wants us dead." Evelyn allowed herself one slow, steady breath. They no longer trusted their own hierarchy, exactly as she intended. She slipped inside through the broken window, staying hidden behind the collapsed rafters. Papers littered the floor, letters torn in half, rosters with names scratched out, meeting schedules abandoned mid-sentence. She scanned the chaos until she found what she needed, a travel route marked for a secret gathering of all commanders in 2 days' time. No robes, no followers, just the 11 men she had spent months studying. That night, in the quiet safety of Pastor Hemphill's cabin, she laid out her plan before the deacons. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. "They're meeting alone," she said. "No guards, no riders, no masks. They want to settle their accusations privately." One of the deacons frowned. "That sounds like a trap." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "It's desperation, and desperation makes men reckless." Hemphill leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped tightly. "What do you intend to do?" Evelyn looked at each of them, her expression calm and resolute. "Not confront them, not expose myself. I only need the right truth placed in the right hands, a truth that convinces each man the others have turned on him." Silence filled the room like rising smoke. Hemphill finally spoke, his voice reverent and trembling. "You mean to end